Good afternoon. Thanks so much for tuning in to today's event, which is co-hosted by Alliance for Justice and the Southern Poverty Law Center. I'm Keith Tyrion, interim co-president of Alliance for Justice, an association of more than 140 member organizations, all committed to building power, transforming courts, and securing justice for all. The Southern Poverty Law Center is not only a co-host of today's event, but one of those valued AFJ member organizations. Before we get started, I want to take some time to acknowledge the last week and the results of the election. Donald Trump's second administration will pose a great threat to civil rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Over the last week, I've gone through a range of emotions, as I'm sure all of you listening have too. Whether you're bringing anger, sadness, fear, or the fire and energy to mobilize, we're glad that you're here in community with us today. When we put this event on the books, we had no way of knowing the election results, but now it's even more timely as we face Trump's explicit threats to test really the limits of our democracy and the rule of law. So now we're putting our faith in the power of all of us coming together to check the most egregious abuses of power that we know he's going to try. Our panelists today will discuss some of the ways that grassroots activism and resistance movements can safeguard our fundamental rights. And I'm sure many of you were part of this very resistance in the first Trump term. We hope all of you will continue to tune in and join us in the movement to protect our democracy. It's going to be required of us over the next 4 years and beyond. And today's conversation is part of our ongoing series, Holding Court Justice Conversations with AFJ, featuring leading activists, authors, scholars, and attorneys to discuss the current political and social justice issues. We're honored for this one to have Ari Berman and LaShawn Warren to discuss Ari's book published earlier this year, Minority Rule, The Right-Wing Attack on the Will of the People and the Fight to Resist It. Before I turn it over to LaShawn to moderate, let me tell you a little bit more about both of them. Both Ari and LaShawn are experts on voting rights and democracy, and we're incredibly lucky they've agreed to join us today. Ari is the National Voting Rights Correspondent for Mother Jones and a reporting fellow at Type Media Center. He's authored 3 books, and his writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Rolling Stone. You also may have seen him as he's a frequent commentator on MSNBC and NPR. LaShawn is the Chief Policy Officer for the Southern Poverty Law Center and its lobbying arm, the SPLC Action Fund. LaShawn oversees the policy agenda of the organization, and her work advances policy on a number of fronts, including voting rights, decarceration of Black and Brown people, eradicating poverty, and the dismantling of white nationalism and supremacy. Thank you so much for joining us today. I can't wait to hear what y'all are going to say. And for everyone tuning in, we also want this to be a discussion with all of you. You can submit questions by commenting via the platform you're tuning into, and we'll set aside time for those at the end. With that, thank you everyone again, and I'll turn it over to you, LaShawn.
Thank you so much, Keith, and good afternoon to everyone. We are so grateful that you have decided to join us for this really important conversation. As Keith mentioned, I am LaShawn Warren. I'm the Chief Policy Officer at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Some of you may be familiar with our organizations, but those of you who are not, we are a racial justice organization, and we work in partnership with communities throughout the South to dismantle white supremacy, to protect, defend, and expand civil and human rights in the South and beyond. We operate in 5 different states in the Deep South: Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. We believe that addressing the deep-rooted issues facing communities in the South, especially Black communities, can serve as a catalyst for national change. As W.B. Du Bois has said, as the South goes, so goes the nation. And I think your book specifically talks about the influence of the South. And so I'm really excited to dig in. So I want to thank everyone for joining us, but especially you, Ari, for sharing your time with us and your wisdom. Before we dive into this book, though, because it's an absolute jewel, one of the things that I want to do is pause for a moment to really at least acknowledge the 2024 election results from last week. Many of us, honestly, are still grappling with a range of emotions around this election: frustration, confusion, unease, uncertainty, and some of us are just pure shook by the results of this election. Trump won on a platform that was fueled by racism, misogyny, bigotry, and promises to make real many of the policies that you highlight in your book, from rolling back civil rights to mass deportation, and weakening our democratic norms and institutions. And so, to be honest with you, Ari, I have to say, I thought we would be having this conversation and the backdrop of a very different political climate. But nonetheless, here we are. And so I would just love to open up the conversation with you by getting your thoughts about this moment. Like, what do you make of this moment, and how are you processing what just happened? You're on mute.
Oh, sorry. I've only done 3,800 Zooms at this point. I'm still processing. To be honest with you, just like you said, we're all still processing. And I just want to thank you for moderating this, and thank you to Alliance for Justice and the Southern Poverty Law Center, two great organizations, for hosting me. I mean, on the one hand, I think that it's not unexpected if you look at the global climate this year. Basically, in every major democracy, the ruling party has been voted out of power for a variety of reasons, but there is a very strong anti-incumbent mood in the world right now, not just in the United States, with anger over the ripple effects of COVID, the economy, a lot of different things out there. It's also true that if you look throughout American history, it's often the case that at these times of economic uncertainty and things of the like, demagogic leaders emerge, quote unquote, strong leaders emerge, and appeals to racism, xenophobia, misogyny become more powerful because people need someone to blame. I think that's certainly true now. It's also the case that Trump's coalition in 2024 is broader than it was in 2016. And he has more of a mandate this time than he had last time. The popular vote's going to narrow, but it looks like he's going to win it. None of the swing states were really that close. So this is not one of those things that if the Democrats had done this one thing differently or that one thing differently, you could say, well, the election would have been different. I think this requires a deeper kind of analysis to try to figure out what happened and how enduring it is. And is this something that's going to be one election, or is there a broader alignment going on? I think from a democracy perspective, and I'd be curious about your thoughts on this, one of the things I'm trying to figure out is in 2020 and 2022, especially, there were bipartisan and nonpartisan coalitions that emerged to defend the democratic system. And those same coalitions we thought were in place for 2024, but they didn't have the same kind of resonance for whatever reason. Wasn't that necessarily people didn't agree with the need to protect American democracy, but I think that there was anger at the way the country was being run. Therefore, people didn't feel like maybe democracy was worth saving in the same kind of way. Now, I think a lot of people are going to have buyer's remorse with that because, listen, the price of eggs comes and goes, but once democracy starts becoming unwound, it's very hard to put it back together. So my fear is that people may have voted more for their short-term interests, which I understand, as opposed to realizing that the longer-term 230 plus year project of American democracy is really at risk here. That felt very abstract to people, but I think they're going to start feeling that in more concrete ways as we head into another Trump term.
Yes, I think in a lot of ways, there are a number of civil rights organizations that are looking to the next 2 years because, as you rightly point out, I think there will be buyer's remorse. There's a lot hanging out here in terms of promises that have been made, and whether or not this particular incoming administration can deliver on a number of these, I'm pretty skeptical. In fact, I do believe the buyer's remorse is very real. So I think I am in the process of still processing too, Ari. But one of the things I can say, reading your book was very insightful. I want to turn back to your book because I think in many ways it was very prophetic, and I think provides an essential historical context for the challenges that we're facing today. It's incredible. It's an incredibly important piece. And so for those of you who have not picked up your copy of this book, I encourage you to do so. It is a huge service to our country in terms of helping people contextualize what they're seeing. This is not just an anomaly. It didn't just happen. And so I'd like to know from you, Ari, why did you decide to write this book? What was the impetus for writing this book? And why did you choose to focus on minority rule?
Well, LaShawn, as you know, I've been covering voting rights for many years. And my previous book, Give Us the Ballot, which was published in 2015, was a history of voting rights and the Voting Rights Act. And as I got deeper into covering voting rights and attacks on voting rights, I began asking the question, why? Why would someone try to make it so hard for someone else to vote? Was this just a political strategy, or was there a deeper strategy at play? And what I realized was there's a deeper strategy at play. And the deeper strategy at play was minority rule, to not be a majority of the country, but to control a majority of power, which I thought was really, really dangerous. And when I looked at Trump's rise to power, I very much understood that Trump is certainly an accelerant to the democratic crisis we're facing, but he's also in many ways a product of a broken political system. And so I wanted to tell that larger story. I wanted for people to understand that there's been this push and pull between democratic and anti-democratic forces throughout our history. And we're at one of those points today, and that it's not linear. I think you always heard Barack Obama quote that famous Martin Luther King quote on the campaign trail, which is the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. I think it's more accurate to say that it often bends towards justice and snaps back. So we're at these points where often at the moments of greatest progress come the biggest attempts at retrenchment. And I think we're clearly in one of those moments of retrenchment right now, where the ruling white power structure feels under siege. And they went through a number of extraordinary tactics to try to remain in power. And they were then able to kind of rebrand their movement. And I think about, not to get too far ahead, but I think about the Lost Cause movement at the end of the Civil War, where white Southerners, they lose the Civil War. There's integrated government for the first time in the South, history you know very well. And then that multiracial democracy is overthrown, right? And the loss of the Civil War becomes a rallying cry for this besieged white power structure to reclaim power once again. And I think that's what happened with Trump and the big lie. After trying to overturn the election, they created a movement that was dead set on taking back power. They figured out just enough buttons to push to get them back in power. But the focus always was on trying to undermine democracy to such an extent that the democratic system would be vulnerable and they would be able to capture it once again.
Ari, as you were talking, one of the things that I was thinking about was how far we've come since the murder of George Floyd, and the kinds of conversations that were happening around his murder, an awakening, if you will. And is it that Americans have a short attention span, memory? Like it just feels very much like people have either forgotten or have chosen to ignore the things that got us here, like the racial backlash, like all of those things that got us to this place. It just seems, even as we talk about stripping African-American history from schools, banning books, the elimination of DEI, the retrenchment of voting rights laws, and more restrictions and voter suppression. It just feels as if either it's how do you explain it? Maybe that's a better question. Like, so why do you think there are white people who feel sieged upon? And it does definitely feel like sometimes when there is success on the side of people of color to some degree, it feels like that the way that it's processed, that something is being taken away. So if your boat
Yeah.
rises, that means that you have taken something away from me personally, and I resent it. Where does that come from?
Well, I think that in some ways it's baked into the system because we have a system that was created by a bunch of wealthy white guys, many of whom were slaveholders, who wanted to prevent a lot of people from being part of democracy. So they had this very idealistic democratic rhetoric about all men are created equal and democracy being based on the consent of the governed. But when it came time, should women be allowed to vote? Should black people be allowed to vote? Should poor white people be allowed to vote? Should Native Americans even be considered citizens? And the answer was no, right? And so whether it's the Electoral College or the structure of the Senate or the 3/5 clause in the House, I mean, all of this was a product of a bunch of really powerful white men trying to, first and foremost, enshrine their own power and create protections for their own power as opposed to the good of the country writ large. So that's something that I think is often ignored, that this kind of elitism and white supremacy is basically baked into the DNA of our country. But listen, Americans, I think, have short memories, and it was very much personified by the fact that people didn't want to talk about all the deaths during COVID, and they didn't want to talk about the January 6th insurrection, which either one of them you think would have disqualified the person who did those kind of things from returning to office. They didn't want to talk about those things, but just think about what it took to have that racial reckoning. It wasn't just George Floyd, right? It was one thing after another to the point where these conversations couldn't be ignored anymore. And why did it take until 2020 that we started asking, why are there monuments to people like Robert E. Lee all across the country? Why in northern states are there Confederate statues? Why aren't people taught about our history to begin with? So it's like we didn't acknowledge our history for so many years. Then we finally acknowledged it. And people went crazy that you could even suggest that America was once a racist country or that stuff like slavery and Jim Crow existed. It was just like a fact. It's not even an opinion. It's just a fact. That's when I always have these arguments about people. It's like, you might not like it, but it happens and you have to acknowledge it, okay? Like, you may not have done it directly, but it did happen, okay? And no one's saying that you yourself are culpable for it, but I do think there's a lesson here, which is that at various times, there's been these struggles to create multiracial democracy. And multiracial democracy works the best when as broad of a coalition is bought into it, right? And for one reason or another, those things started to fray in 2024. And you had a lot of people that I believe benefited from multiracial democracy voting against it, which is somewhat paradoxical to explain, because they had someone else to blame, right? They thought, okay, if I'm not doing as good as I should be, it's that person's fault or it's this person's fault. And so it felt like the 2024 election just became like a very large blame game in terms of like, let's scapegoat this person, let's scapegoat that person, let's scapegoat. And it was always like, the more vulnerable you are, the more you are scapegoated, right? And as opposed to saying, like, actually democracy is going to work better for everyone if more people are included. So I think that it's going to take a while to sift through of maybe we have to talk about democracy different. Maybe we have to talk about race and gender and these things differently. Maybe we need reckonings to happen, but maybe we need to think about how this all plays out in terms of society. I don't know, but I think that to maintain support for these kind of things, they're also going to have to be popular. And the question is, how do we give people the medicine they need while also saying that this medicine is ultimately going to make your life better at the end of the day?
And I really appreciate those insights, Ari. Like, so one of the things that I thought about as I was reading your book, I was thinking about the fact that our country is becoming more diverse, right? So you
Yeah.
talk about Pat Buchanan, you talked about a series of other politicians who kept ringing the alarm bell, and it's interesting that Trump was able to repackage some of the rhetoric, some of the toxic rhetoric, and it started to resonate with people, or maybe it was there all along. But what do you think is driving this fear of a more diverse? Just, I mean, if we're just putting the democracy aside, but just a more diverse country, there seems to be, particularly as we talk about like the most vulnerable populations, when we're talking about immigration in particular, and we'll dive into that a little bit more, there seems to be such hostility with respect to immigration, but not immigration of Europeans, but immigration of people of color. And so, like, if you like, do you have any insights as to like what is animating people's fears? And I'm assuming that it's fears with respect to the diversification of the country.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I opened the book with Pat Buchanan because of what Buchanan stood for. That his 1992 and 1996 presidential campaigns were premised on the defense of what he called America's shrinking white minority, what he called America's emerging white minority, because his runs for president in the 1990s coincided with the U.S. Census predicting for the first time that America would one day become a majority minority country, which is now projected to happen sometime in the 2040s. And, listen, race sometimes can be a fluid concept, so that could change. What does it mean to be majority minority is in and of itself a debate. But the fact is that I think for a lot of people, they feel like sort of white Christian America as they knew it is slipping away. And I think it was, personified by, Obama's election, and then, Biden being elected by this multiracial coalition, and then Kamala Harris, a black woman, running for president. And I think a lot of those fears started to become personified about how the country was changing. And then, but I mean, Trump's coalition is so strange because on the one hand, it's all of these people that are clearly motivated by defending white power. At the same time, he's making inroads, particularly among working class people of color, by telling them that they have something to fear from this too, right? That they might be immigrants themselves, right? But they did it legally. So they should blame the people that are coming illegally, even if they're coming illegally for a very good reason, which is that their home countries are so dangerous and terrible that they're risking their lives to come over here in search of a better life. But I mean, you saw that, with, for example, the discussion of the Haitians in Springfield, right? Where, I mean, there was no dispute over whether or not they were here legally. They were here legally. They were asked to come, but they were demonized because of what they represented, right? Which was the browning of America, and America leading to looking differently. Now, again, this is contradictory because I went through a lot of the exit polls today more closely. And you ask people, a majority of people don't want mass deportation, but like they just voted for it, right? A majority of people want abortion to remain legal, but 40% of the people that said abortion should be legal in most cases voted for Trump, who represents at the very least a party that wants to make abortion illegal in almost, if not all cases. And so, again, it may be that people voted for certain things, like they voted for the economy, and it's not like they didn't care about these issues, but these were secondary to the issues that they cared most about. But because the results are so contradictory, I think that if Trump starts leaning in to this more white power strategy and starts really doing mass deportations and a lot of those things, kind of the white Christian nationalist policies, I think he's going to start to lose some of the base that may have, I don't even want to say the base, but some of the voters that may have held their nose and voted for him because they didn't like the party in power?
Well, we will see very soon. I think by the appointments that are being announced at this moment, it seems like he's very serious in terms of leaning into promises that he made on the election trail. So let me just as I read your book, Ari, I was reminded of a Maya Angelou quote that says, "You really can't know where you're going until you know where you've been." And I think in many respects, it underscores exactly what we were talking about a few moments ago with respect to the history and its importance. And you, in your book, you go through, like, you've done a lot of work for this book, I can tell. So in your book, you describe in meticulous detail the historical discourse that shaped the Constitution. Can you share with us, like, why did you think it was so important to talk about the foundation, to talk about some of those the arguments that were happening about the Senate and the representatives and this, whether slaves would be counted and whether they should be able to vote? Like, why did you feel like that foundation was so important to include it in this book?
Because I think it helps explain a lot of why we're at today, why our system remains in many ways so flawed and undemocratic, and that things like the Electoral College or the current supermajority in the Supreme Court didn't come out of nowhere, but they're a product. They're a product, first off, of people, our founding fathers, who in many ways were visionary, but also realized that they were a distinct minority at the time, a white male property holding, in many ways slave holding minority that wanted to protect their own power at the expense of a much larger majority of Americans, which included poor white people, women, African Americans, Native Americans, who were basically written out of the Constitution's protections. But then, even within that frame, there was all these powerful minority factions that gained power, right? So the small states gain more power in the Senate, so that each state has the same level of representation in the Senate regardless of population, which makes the Senate basically an instrument of minority rule. That the House is going to be the only democratically elected part of the government. But then the slave states say, well, we won't have as much power as the free states. Therefore, you get the 3/5 clause, which gives, African Americans are counted for a 3/5 of a person only for purposes of representation, right? It wasn't like enslaved African Americans were given 3/5 of rights otherwise. Right. So it was only done to help the white slaveholding elite that ran the South. Then you get to the president, and James Madison gets up and says at the convention that I actually think that the people should elect the president directly. The problem is I come from a slave state, Virginia, and if we have a popular election, the free states will have more power than the slave states. Therefore, I don't support a popular election. And that's how we get this crazy electoral college mechanism where you can lose the you can win the popular vote, but lose the popular vote, but still win the electoral college, which didn't happen this time, but very well could have happened. And so I think it's important to understand that these compromises still in many ways shape our politics today. We have a Supreme Court, for example, in which 5 of 6 conservative justices were appointed by Republican presidents who didn't initially win the popular vote and were confirmed by senators who were not elected by a majority of Americans. So I think it has real consequences, but I also think it shaped this battle between democratic and anti-democratic forces that's been going on for 230 plus years. And this question of how democratic are we? And should we lean in a more democratic direction or a less democratic direction? And I think that is something that is still playing out today. Again, one of the most important data points in the election was that 34% of Americans said that the threat of democracy was their number one issue in the election. That was actually the top issue in the election. Those voters voted 80% for Kamala Harris. The problem was, on all the other issues, people voted for Trump. So, for those people that thought democracy was the most important issue, they didn't want Trump to remain in power. The problem was that they were convinced that other issues were more important than democracy. I think that is ultimately going to be a mistake, because I think they're ultimately going to realize that when democracy is undermined, all other rights are undermined as well. That was evidently an abstract message for many people in 2024. If they feel like their daily lives are not being improved by the democratic system, they're going to have less faith in democracy. But I also think that a lot of people don't realize how vulnerable our democratic system is, and how it can be a lot worse. I also think, just the last point I want to make on this is that too often when we talk about defending democracy, people hear it as defending the status quo, as opposed to try and create a better democratic system. Because if you asked me, and I imagine, LaShawn, same with you, are you happy with how democracy works today? We would also probably say no, right? So no one wants to be in the position of defending a status quo that is largely indefensible. But the problem is it can get a lot worse. I think the reform message is what was missing, right? How are you going to make the democratic system better? That is not a message that I heard a lot about in 2024. And I think it made people less willing to try to defend a system if they feel like that system's already not working for them.
So, I mean, it's interesting that you, like, there's so much packed in there. One of the things that I want to just at least go back to and give a nod to is this idea that I've heard, like, with the Federalist Society and even Supreme Court justices, where they talk about the founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution, with such reverence. Yeah. And they talk about them as if they are infallible, that they're not, that they're like almost godlike, which is just like ridiculous to me. Yeah. And that they got it right, and that they could envision at this point, and this is sort of the problem with the originalist construction theory, that they could imagine where we would be, and the structure that they put in place was enduring, that could last and really respond to the challenges that we face right now. It's a problematic way of thinking that you can't be reflective and improve a system because the system is no longer functioning well and doesn't really function as a democracy in the way that they said they wanted it to function potentially. Like it was supposedly a democracy in theory, but obviously really designed to protect their interest. And, I think, as you say, we are absolutely seeing that play itself out right now. And where
can I just make a point about that?
Of course, yes.
Sure. I'm really glad you brought up originalism, because I think you're making some really good points about why it's such a dangerous ideology. First off, our original democratic system was flawed and is not that democratic. And so when you talk about originalism, are you defending the 3/5 clause? Are you defending, women not being able to vote, African Americans not being able to vote, poor white people not able to vote? I mean, so that if you look at the system as it was intended, that's how it was originally intended. Secondly, which interpretation of history are you following? Because one of the things I did when I researched this book is I read all the debates at the Constitutional Convention in the spring of 1787. It's fascinating because there's strenuous debates about these kind of things, like the Senate. So, for example, when each state gets 2 senators, regardless of population, that's basically the slave states and the small states holding the larger states hostage, essentially. And Madison says this is going to allow what he calls a more trifling minority than ever to control the body, as more sparsely populated Western states get admitted to the Union, which of course is exactly what happened. Mm-hmm. So if you're talking about an originalist interpretation of the U.S. Senate, are you including that Madison, one of the most foremost founders, and lots of other founders, absolutely hated the way that the system ended up being set up? And then thirdly, I mean, the system was followed from the beginning. The Bill of Rights, so all of the rights that we think about as sort of integral to U.S. democracy, free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, all those things, they weren't part of the original Constitution.
They happened after.
So, I mean, they happened after. So they was amended because it was insufficiently democratic and insufficiently protective of people's individual rights. So the founders knew that it would have to be corrected. And so they could never have imagined a society with 330 million people, right? And what that would mean in 50 states and the breadth of the US. I mean, they probably would have thought that the government honestly would have been changed much more than it actually has. They would probably be shocked to think that, okay, that why do we still have an electoral college? Why do we still have Supreme Court justices appointed to life who are not accountable to the public? Why do we still have a Senate in which someone in Wyoming has 68 times the voting power of someone from California? So, I mean, I think that's the problem is I think even the founders felt like some of the stuff they were creating was defective and needed to be corrected. And I think it's been corrected a lot less than we would have hoped or liked to assume.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, I think in reading your book, it reinforced what I had always kind of felt, that there's a gross unfairness, particularly as it pertains to the Senate. When you start talking about the numbers of people that live on the western and eastern seaboard versus the middle of the country, it's amazing that we're continuing to go to really engage in this kind of a system that really is blatantly unfair. I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I would love to get your thoughts about that. But I want to just move us to a little bit of what you talked about in the prologue of your book, where you were talking about where you remind readers that in the 1960s there was a commitment to equality.
Yeah.
Seeming a commitment to equality that replaced white supremacy, the white supremacist framework that resulted obviously in second-class citizenship for brown and Black people. And that period, was marked with a number of major civil rights pieces of legislation that we benefit from even today. I mean, and it was a pretty significant expansion and really did address a lot of Jim Crow that the Southerners had imposed on Black and brown people. So you talked about the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but then you also talk about the Immigration and Nationality Act. Could you talk a little bit about what was the backlash to some of those laws, and how has that backlash been weaponized in order for there to be political gain by the right?
I'm glad you brought that up, LaShawn. There's this remarkable period from July 1964 to October 1965 in which the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Immigration Act are all passed. And this transforms the politics and demographics of the country because the Civil Rights Act creates equality in all sorts of public spheres. The Voting Rights Act strikes down all of the barriers that have prevented Black people from voting in the South and then brought many more people into American democracy. And the Immigration Act changes a system in which basically only immigrants from Europe were let into the country. And so a lot of people from the developing world come in, the demographics of the country start changing. A lot of people, America becomes a lot bigger. American democracy becomes a lot more diverse. That puts the country on a path to a majority-minority future. And as you say, it sparks a backlash. And it sparks a backlash of people who are threatened by the extension of new rights to people, the expansion of American democracy, the changing demographics of the country. Obviously, that is a central theme of the 2024 election, whether it's attacking migrants, attacking non-white immigrants, attacking more vulnerable people. I mean, one of the most famous Trump ads, was Trump is for you, Kamala is for they, them, which was about, again, that's a lot bigger than, I think one of the reasons that ad succeeded was it was much bigger than transgender rights. It spoke to a fear that the country is slipping away from the people that identify with Trump. And so I think that backlash is very, very strong right now. And I really worry because, as you know, next year is the 60th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, and it's hanging by a thread. And it's not being interpreted in a generous way, to put it mildly, by the people that Donald Trump are appointing to the court. So I really wonder about their survival of things like the Voting Rights Act if there's 200 more federal judges put on. And so I think we're going to have to rededicate ourselves not just to defending these laws, but also to improving them, right? Because things that were done 60 years ago are incredibly important, but you also need to modify and adapt them to a changing America. And I think it's going to be a big struggle in the next 4 years to hold on to the gains of the 1960s and also to present an alternative vision about what comes after this and how to build a functional multiracial democracy for the 21st century.
And to your point, Ari, there has been such an erosion of voting rights, starting with actually the Monroe case, and then moving on to the Shelby County case. But I want to go back to something you said related to the they, them kind of advertisement and campaign slogan. I remember as a young person, it's so interesting, like how this rhetoric it continues to permeate our society, but it's repurposed, right? There was an election with oh my gosh, it was North Carolina, Helms.
Yeah, Jesse Helms, the white hands.
Yes, there was a white hand. Like as a kid, I remember that commercial where there was a pink slip and white hands where they balled up the piece of paper and said something to the effect of, you deserve this job, but they gave it to them. And this demonization of people of color, of immigrants, like there is this again, like it goes back to this theme that we were talking about where you have, if I lose, it's because of someone else. If something bad happens to me, it's because of those people who don't look like me, right? Yeah. And they are the ones who have taken something away from me. And it's so interesting how easily people are able to latch onto that without really the critical thinking that I think is absolutely necessary in this moment to go a step deeper in terms of analyzing the information that you're hearing. And I think it really does underscore why we need to focus on the misinformation and disinformation that really is permeating our society, and why we need to be really concerned that Elon Musk is actually whispering in the ear of President Trump.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. And I have to say, when I see that, working class voters along racial lines are basically voting for a candidate who himself has no concept of their struggles, but is also basically being propped up by hundreds of millions of dollars from the richest people in America. It feels like we're trending towards an oligarchical society, and it's really hard for me to square that the voters on the lower end of the spectrum feel like the oligarchs care about them, right? And so that's something that I think is really hard to imagine, and I think that's why you had to have other issues to try to motivate people, and that's why they push so much of those cultural issues. And I always found it to be very jarring when people said, why aren't Democrats focused more on the economy, when it was the Republicans that were running all the ads about Kamala wants to give migrants transgender surgeries. I mean, so like the Republicans were the ones running the culture wars, and that may not have been why they won, but I think they were able to distract a lot of people with that kind of rhetoric, and it was just about finding someone to blame. And when things aren't going as well in the country, that's when it's a lot easier to blame people. I mean, you have to even remember, like it was a time of relative prosperity in America when the civil rights measures passed, and when the economy started souring and things like that. That's when you started to see more of the backlash to these kind of measures start kicking in, which isn't to say that it's always defined by the economy, because I don't think anyone believes that that was the reason why we had
Yeah.
things like Jim Crow. But at the same time, I mean, it's easier to get, I think, people to vote against their own interests when there is, something to blame, and or someone to blame. And I think it's dangerous. I think it's dangerous. I think, one of the things about America that I think we all celebrate is its diversity and is its inclusion. And if we start getting away from those basic values, I think the country starts looking and representing something different. And that starts echoing into the darker history that people, I think, forget about, don't want to learn about, don't want to be reminded of, but is there whether we like it or not. And I just worry that we are creeping into one of those darker periods. And when we get into those darker periods, sometimes it takes a lot longer to get out of them than you can believe. I mean, you think about the fact that 15th Amendment was passed in 1870, and saying that the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, and basically was ignored until 1965 when we passed the Voting Rights Act. You'd like to think that it shouldn't take nearly 100 years to basically enforce an already passed civil rights statute, but that's a part of a history that I think we can't ignore.
That's real. I want to, oh my gosh, that's a little, it's scary. But that is, the good thing is that we are still standing and we are here to fight to make sure that it's not 100 years in order for us to realize our constitutional rights. We did talk a little bit about the courts, but I want to shift to the courts a little bit, because in your book, one of the things that you say is that the Supreme Court, you have a chapter entitled "The Most Dangerous Branch," and so I'm wondering if you can tease that out a little bit. What makes the Supreme Court so dangerous, and these tactics that we were talking about with respect to like two senators, regardless of the population of the state, how the sort of leveraging those particular processes influence what we're seeing play out in the Supreme Court right now?
Well, I mean, you had a Supreme Court and lower courts that were a product of an undemocratic system, a product of presidents who didn't have majority support, a product of senators who didn't have majority support, being put in all sorts of underhanded ways, blocking Merrick Garland from receiving a hearing 8 months before the election, but confirming Amy Coney Barrett 8 days before the election when 50 million people had already voted. So first off, the majority was constructed in all these anti-democratic ways. Then, of course, they did a lot of things that made the country less democratic, things like going directly against public opinion and taking away fundamental rights on issues like abortion, shielding Trump from any kind of accountability for his actions. I mean, I keep thinking about how different the campaign would have looked if Trump had to face trials in New York and Washington, not New York, in Florida and in DC, Georgia, that never actually happened, and in Georgia. I mean, but direct result of obstruction by judges, appointed or sympathetic to Trump, resulted in, no case being brought in Florida, no case being brought for inciting an insurrection. And I mean, I just think that completely transformed the campaign, because if Donald Trump had been in court the whole time instead of campaigning, it would have been a different election. People would have been reminded of it. And I think that was an example of the Supreme Court and the lower courts, the judges appointed by Trump, tipping the scales of justice in a way that was very authoritarian and much more in keeping with something that you'd see happen in a place like Hungary or happen in a place like Russia than happen in a place like the United States, where basically, I mean, imagine if I just wrote out a scenario for you where a candidate tries to overturn an election, he wants to run again, he's about to be, he's indicted, and the judges that he appointed bail him out. I mean, that sounds like the kind of thing that happens in an autocratic regime, and instead it happened here in our ostensibly democratic system. So I don't think the courts ever get nearly as much attention. I think it should have been a bigger role in the campaign. My hope is that one of the things that Biden does in the last 2 months he's in office, his focus is on confirming judges, and the Senate focuses on confirming judges because that's one of the tangible things they can do to give Trump fewer vacancies on the federal court. But we have to get people to vote on these issues. I mean, people voted on issues like Dobbs in 2022 and didn't seem to vote on them the same kind of way in 2024. And it wasn't even like the public opinion shifted. People remained firmly pro-choice. They just decided that some issues mattered more than abortion, for example, and that they were okay with the guy that overturned Roe v. Wade being put in charge of all of the next judges that can then further undermine abortion rights. I don't totally understand that, but I think in general, I feel like the courts determine so much about the country. That's one thing that presidents have so much power over relative to other things. And it's something that seems to always motivate the right, but doesn't motivate as much of the left. And I think 2024 showed that to be the case once again.
And also the role that the Senate plays too here, it's problematic for sure. One of the things that I do want to lift up, Ari, I really do appreciate the fact that you had personal touches in your book where you lift up the lived experiences of people of color trying to vote, doing the best they can. And just by one fluke, like losing a driver's license or something like that, weren't unable to vote. I want to just talk for a minute about those voters who are disillusioned by the process, right? We talked just a minute ago about Trump and his ability to really evade justice, in various courts. And there are people, and I've heard this since after the election results came out, there are people who feel disillusioned and don't want to engage in a system where they feel like there are two systems: one that services folks who do things that are illegal but get away with it, and then there are other people who do far less things and they're crushed for it, and they get 50 years or so. And so what came back, some of the responses that I got back from like some of the individuals that in my circle I talk with who decided either not to engage or really frustrated by the process, I have to say I struggle to be able to articulate for them why it feels like there is a different justice for Trump versus the ordinary person, right? And I would just love to get your thoughts about that and encouraging people to engage in a system they feel is fundamentally unfair.
Well, that I think is a big story of the election, which is that Trump only marginally improved his vote share, but Harris got dramatically fewer votes than Biden did in 2020. So people didn't show up again. And I think they didn't show up because they were disillusioned with the system. They felt like they voted and things didn't change the way they liked. And they feel like democracy is not worth defending because the democratic system doesn't work for them. And that's why I say when we talk about defending democracy, we also have to acknowledge why people are frustrated with democracy and why it's not a perfect system and how it can be improved, both to be more representative of people, but also to impact people's daily lives. And people have to see the connection between democracy working and their lives getting better, or understand that when democracy doesn't work, their lives get worse. And they have to have some personal investment in this process. And I think for a lot of people, that became abstract, that there were people that saw how democracy was weakened on things like abortion rights, and it really did motivate them. But there were other people that felt like the parties were too similar, the system was too corrupt, there's too much money in the process, and that sort of the average person's voice and vote isn't being represented, so why bother? And that's why I think it's so important that democracy becomes a tangible thing, not an abstract thing, and that reforming democracy becomes as important of a message as protecting it, right? Because if people just feel like they're voting for a status quo that's already broken, that's going to be hard to convince them. But when people can understand, if I vote, then things can start to get better, and that voting is just the first thing that you do as part of being an engaged citizen, maybe that's the way to start getting them back.
Thank you, Ari. Okay, I know that we're nearing the end of our hour, but I see that there is one question in the queue. I want to make sure that we get to it, and if you could answer it briefly, I'll turn it back over to Keith afterwards, after a few remarks. What advice would you offer for pro-democracy mobilization? That's a question for
Well,
the
I
audience.
mean, I would say everyone's going to have to do their best to defend the rights that we have on the federal level. And I would also just say, do what you can in your own community, because there's a lot of things that people can do in their own backyards that help people's lives and also can counter what is going to be coming out of the federal government. So, if you're I think people should stay focused on Washington, but if they feel hopeless, if they feel disillusioned, find something you can do in your own neighborhood, in your own community that can help people's lives, because I think that is another roadmap for change. But I also think it's something that everyone can tangibly do to keep themselves hopeful and motivated going forward. And so that's personally what I'm going to think about doing in my own life is, obviously keep focused on the national stuff, but don't forget trying to improve the place where I live. And I think that everyone should try to do the same. And then hopefully there'll be opportunities for some course correction in the not too distant future.
Thank you, Ari. And before I turn it over to Keith, I just want to close with a couple of thoughts. One of the powerful ideas that you close in your book with is the concept of new laboratories of democracy, laboratories where we experiment, we test ideas, and we grow from those experiences. There are places of innovation where we develop and advance new approaches to protect our communities. In some ways, we do not know what lies ahead for us, given last week, but what we do know is this: we must be as deliberate and determined as those seeking to undermine the will of the majority. And so this has just been a wonderful conversation, Ari, and really, really do appreciate your time and this gift of a book that you've provided for us. I'll turn it back over to Keith.
Thanks so much, LaShawn. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much, LaShawn and Ari, and really for ending us on a note of hope. I know I, for one, really appreciated the reminder that while we might be facing some dark days and progress can generate backlash, that it's on us to swing the pendulum back and not only defend our laws, but make them better. I'm really going to take that to heart in the coming weeks, months, and years. Beyond those times, AFJ and SPLC will continue the resistance and the fight for progress, and we hope you'll join us in that. If you haven't gotten your copy of Minority Rule yet, just be sure to pick up your copy today and hopefully support your local bookstore. You can also follow AFJ, SPLC, and Ari himself on social media to stay up to date on future events and the issues that we've discussed today. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. It's been a rough week. We are in this together, and we will see you next time.